Good afternoon, friends. If we settle down, we'll begin with this session. So, after an interesting session in the morning on, the employment issue, we are now talking about the middle income trap. This is quite contextual in the sense that the Prime Minister has been talking about making India a developed nation by 2047. So in that sense, and we in NITI Aayog have been working with all the ministries of the government and stakeholders outside to prepare actually a roadmap and a vision for 2047. So in that context, I think the issue of India, of the middle income trap actually becomes very, very relevant because India is a low middle income country, and the hope is that in the next 2.5 decades, India actually breaks out of the middle income trap or doesn't get trapped in a middle income trap. I don't think we are yet in it, and then move on to being a developed nation. The issues are many. We have an interesting panel. There's a presentation by Somik, Lall, which will be followed by a discussion. But just want to highlight, everybody's familiar with the World Bank study about 15 years ago, 100 odd nations in the 60s, about a dozen or so, 13 broke out of the middle income trap, which were there, is pretty well known. But the bigger thing is, those countries which actually broke out of the middle income trap had a sustained growth rate of anywhere between 8, 9, 10% for 25 years. That's one hell of a performance, which is very, very difficult. So in an Indian context, if you're actually going to become a developed economy, we have to sustain a similar kind of a growth rate, something higher than we have not achieved over the last 15, 20 years, or may have touched it for a year or two sometime, and maintain it for 25 years. That means there has to be, it's not being satisfied with the current rate of growth is not going to be enough. We have to unlock more bottlenecks and see that we can actually sustain it. The questions that arise is this doable? Are we in a position to actually do it, or are we dreaming? Is it a dream worth dreaming? And the other is, if it is worth dreaming, how do you go about doing it? And I'm sure as we go through this session, we will hear more about it. But a couple of common things between the countries who have actually been breakout countries, if you call them, have been 2 or 3 things. One is, of course, a lot of focus on manufacturing. That has been there. But we have to understand the context is different. This is between 60s to 2000, 2005, post-WTO. There has been an explosion in international trade, particularly in goods. And of course, thanks to technology, the breaking up of manufacturing across many countries. So I think that was one thing which is common to most countries. And the second thing, which is almost a corollary, which is openness to trade. Extremely open economies. So I think the two of them went together in helping whoever actually has grown fast. Now the question then arises, what's the counterfactual? The other 90, were all of them protected, not open to trade, protectionist, or did they not have that kind of a focus on manufacturing? That's a question probably we'll try to see as we go along. These are of course supported by a couple of other things, which is investment in R&D, infrastructure, building the institutional frameworks that are needed to ensure these things happen, and also having a society where there is domestic demand coming out of more equality within among different classes in terms of incomes. So that can also generate consumer demand. So you have a whole range of issues, and of course one of the issues that came up in the earlier discussion, which actually is probably more relevant here, which is about countries having being sophisticated economies which are capable of managing complex processes. I think that's the hallmark of a modern economy, which is developed in nature. And I think it's, I think Harvard or somebody who produces actually an index of the complexity of the economy, and it's a very good indicator that if you mastered complex systems, like in manufacturing, while in one end of the manufacturing value chain you have, say, textiles or leather, which is at the bottom end, other end I would say is something like manufacturing a civilian aircraft. A civilian aircraft is actually one of the most complex engineering exercises, which brings in a lot of elements together and actually has a very high safety factor also. So that is one hallmark, because the more complex economies become, or more sophisticated, they're able to handle process of that nature. And that is also bringing us to the point which was discussed earlier today, which is about firms. because these can't be done by individuals, they have to be done in organizations. I mean, actually, India was actually a leading manufacturing nation in 1700, 1800. Last night I was reading about Calcutta and how actually Bengal produced 40% of the world's textiles, Bengal alone, and how it was a hub of that. The question is, among many theories, is India didn't pile on to the joint stock company wagon. India didn't invent it, nor did it have one. It remained as family-owned enterprises or partnerships. And I think the joint stock company's invention led to an explosion, probably, in accumulation of capital and direction of resources in particular directions, which led to that. So I will stop here. I will first ask Somik, who's going to make a presentation. This will be for about 25 minutes, and then we'll move on to the other panelists. Somik.
All right, good morning, everyone. I'm really happy to be here and tell you about the emerging messages from the World Development Report that's going to come out later this month. Its title is The Middle Income Trap. And Poonam, thank you very much for inviting us, but also being part of our advisory council. It's really helped us sharpen the report. So here's what I'm going to do over the next 25 minutes. I'll do three things. I will first provide stylized facts on the middle income trap, a term that was coined by the World Bank chief economist Indamit Gill and his co-author Homi Kharas back in 2007. It's a term that is debated among empirical economists, including those in this room, but it seems to be a real fear among policymakers in middle-income countries. I'll highlight that growth in middle-income countries is slower, it is different, and it is getting harder. And what our research has shown is that middle-income countries need two, not one transition to move from middle incomes to high incomes. Second, I'll tell you about the analytic framework that we use in the report. It's based on ideas of creative destruction to identify the forces of creation that enable change and add value, the forces of preservation that hold on to the status quo, and the need to destroy outdated arrangements in all spheres of the economy and society. And Ufuk, who is our lead academic and a professor at the University of Chicago, is one of the leading researchers in the world who looks at modern versions of Schumpeterian creative destruction. And what we find is to be really helpful for policy making, there is need to update our analytic lens. A lot of discussion in the previous session and the discussions in the sessions yesterday focused on firm size. We argue that's not very helpful. You should focus on value added by firms regardless of the size of the firm. Second, a lot of debates in countries happen around targeting the distribution of income, on obsessing about levels and measures of inequality. We say that's not really useful. Think about social mobility instead. And third, and I think even yesterday in some of the conversations, there were discussions about focusing and targeting specific sources of energy for a low-carbon transition. We argue that's not really helpful. Let's focus on emissions, not the sources of energy. And finally, I will highlight some insights for policy that is based on the experience of some of the economies that have been discussed, like Korea, but those who move fast from middle income to high income. And what these economies did was they did three things. First, they disciplined powerful incumbents, not vilify them. They developed talent by rewarding merit of everyone in society. And they capitalized on crises to alter policies and institutions that were no longer useful. So let me start by showing you a picture of Deng Xiaoping. And Deng is known for a variety of reasons, but he was really instrumental for reforms that led China to the incredible growth rates we have seen. And he raised the term, and he called the term, to get rich is glorious. And by saying so, he really released the aspiration genie out of the bottle. And today, if you look at policy documents, whether in China or in India and Vietnam and South Africa, every country wants to become a high-income nation in 1 generation or 2. And all these countries have amazing vision documents of their governments saying how they're going to do it. So there's incredible optimism, at least in the halls of government. But when you look at the real world, there is a problem. And the problem is that economic well-being in middle-income countries is nowhere close to catching up to the levels in advanced economies. And what we see is that right from the 1970s, the mean per capita GDP or mean per capita incomes has not risen more than 1/10 of the US. And we have been criticized often on why you use the US, but we're using that as an example of the global frontier. And the reason is that there are only 25 million people who live in countries that are richer than the United States. And the reason we don't see a lot of catching up is, first, what we find is there's a systematic slowdown in growth rates as countries move from low incomes to middle incomes. And here, Lant, we use a paper of yours where you identify growth slowdowns, and we look at every growth slowdown we have seen over the last 50 years. And what we see is that the median growth slowdown happens in a middle-income country, but then a middle-income country is 3 times more likely to experience a slowdown relative to a high-income country. And we also find that countries that have weak institutions, whether economic freedom or political rights, get these slowdowns earlier, and they last longer. And what we also find on the right, and this is using data from the Penn World Tables, is that development strategies that worked well when countries were in low incomes, this don't really matter when you get to middle incomes or more. So if capital endowments were the only thing that mattered, let's assume, right? Middle-income countries would be 75% of the incomes of high-income countries, not the 25% we see. And in fact, when Indamith and Somik, they coined the term the middle-income trap, they warned that countries are facing sort of a structural stasis. They can't get rid of the structures that got them from low incomes to middle incomes, and they think that the policies that got them to middle incomes are going to get them to high incomes, and that's not going to happen. And so what we do in the WDR is make a case that countries need to sophisticate the economic structures. And Lant, again, this is a point I build on the ones you made in this morning, and we look here at measures of economic complexity that Ricardo Hausmann and his colleagues developed. And we find that it's not diversifying that matters, it's not re-specializing that matters. It is for countries who move from $5,000 to $35,000, $40,000, $45,000 per capita, the one thing that matters is increasing economic complexity. We have, you could say, the Ricardo Hausmann's measure may be flawed. There are other measures of patent citations about looking at use of technology that tell us similar points. But then, how do you do this, right? And what we define in our framework is that countries need to rethink their growth strategies. They need to not only do investment, they need to do something else. But very often, we have heard in many middle-income countries, including here, we need to be innovators. Well, what does it mean to be innovators, right? Innovators means I'm going to get global ideas and I'm going to create global ideas. And countries that prematurely go from investment to innovation pretty much fall kind of hobble and kind of have the growth slow down. So what we define, and I will show you in a few examples and some data, that countries need to move from a one-eye strategy, that's of investment, to next move to a two-eye strategy, that's to complement investment with infusion. And that's a term that means you get ideas from the rest of the world, build up your capabilities to produce those ideas, to kind of master those ideas, and use those technologies to compete in the world. Only when you figure out how to use these technologies well, you start pushing the global frontier and you move to a 3I strategy when you combine investment, infusion, and innovation. At some early point in the report, we used the term imitation. But we felt that's not a term that's really appealing, and it's much more than imitating. It's actually using these technologies to produce new products. The way we define it in the report, and I'll try to explain to you why, is that the 2I strategy applies largely to middle-income countries. There may be sectors that are leading, but largely applies to lower middle-income countries. And the 3I strategy largely applies to upper middle-income countries. So in general, countries need to think about recalibrating the mix of the 3 drivers of growth: investment, infusion, and innovation as they move through middle incomes. So let me give you a couple of examples to explain what I mean. So these are charts that show the rapid rise of countries that have moved from middle incomes to high incomes. There's Korea, that has probably been one of the fastest developers, growing from incomes of close to $100 to $30,000. We have Poland, which dramatically grew from 10% of European averages to 50% after it joined the European Union. And Chile, which discovered copper and moved from middle incomes to high incomes. But for this, I'm going to contrast in the next few minutes the stories of Korea and Brazil, and I'll tell you why. This is a picture on the right that Pierre-Olivier showed last night, and I'm going to give you a different interpretation of that. And the research done is actually done by one of our background author contributors and who was a student of Ufuk's. So the picture on the left is 1970s engineers at Samsung. These are all men who are being sent to NEC in Japan. And they're going to learn how to make televisions and how to make parts. And so they're acquiring global leaders, global technologies, and bringing it back to Samsung. At the same time, on the right, what you see is the Korean government, seeing these opportunities, is helping companies or chaebols like Samsung acquire global technologies. They're subsidizing infusion. They're making it cheaper for them. So the time goes on, Samsung starts licensing NEC's technology, starts making televisions and selling it to markets overseas. So they're competing in global markets. Very soon, Korean televisions are better than Japanese televisions. NEC gets worried. NEC increases the price of licensing. At that time, the Korean government says, well, okay, now we're going to support you to move, we're going to support innovation, so you create new products, not only do infusion. So in a way, it was they mastered infusion and then made to move to innovation. The second point that Korea did, and this relates to the last panel, is that as companies like NEC started getting sophisticated, they required more skilled workers. They needed engineers. They needed people who could manage shop floors and plans. They needed better managers. And at that time, the Ministry of Education, through its public universities and regulation of private institutions, set targets, increased budgets, and monitored the development of these skills. And these companies, as they sort of infuse global technologies, they also required more specialized capital. For an economy at an infusion stage, investment remains really important. Some of the simplified models that you see in the literature, they will try to tell or they show to us that its investment is no longer important, it's only innovation or technology, but we see it's the combination of both, which makes it a really challenging problem. Now let me tell you a different story. In Brazil, policymakers were very concerned that getting American technologies and infusing them would widen inequalities in the country. And so they said, okay, we don't really want to infuse, we want to create our new ideas. See, here's what they did. They started giving incentives to their domestic incumbents to start patenting. The problem is that the Brazilian Patent Office had no way of knowing what's a new idea from a bad idea. And they had no way of knowing whether it's a new technology or an expired American technology that's been given a patent to. So patent applications really took off. These firms started growing. For good measure, the Brazilian government had a 10% import tariff on the same products that would come from elsewhere. So these firms are doing well. It's just that nobody was citing their patents. These patents were pretty irrelevant to the rest of the world. The knowledge was not really important. At the same time, by shielding domestic incumbents, the Brazilians were keeping foreign entry at bay. The result is a dramatic shift downwards in Brazilian incomes per capita relative to the US. At the same time, Korea moved from about 20% of US incomes to close to 60%. So what we do know is from other countries is also that those that have succeeded have followed these ideas of infusion, then innovation. But even for countries who take these ideas of going from 1I to 2I to 3I, this is not an easy process. This is not a linear process. But this process is getting even more challenging. And the reason I think Pierre-Olivier and the whole panel discussed yesterday is rising protectionism. And what we do here is find out these distortive trade policies to support local incumbents. And what you see is a trend that the richer the country is, the more protective policies it can put in place. But unlike the discussion yesterday, it's not only the OECD countries are doing it, it's some of the large middle-income countries who are doing active protectionism, and especially in the guise of using green industrial policy. This is making technology diffusion more challenging. This is making it even more challenging for the average middle-income country to grow. So what I'll do in my remaining 10 minutes is to kind of say, if a country has to move from investment to investment and infusion, and then switch to innovation, how does it happen? And here, what we know is that what we do is that we use the ideas developed by Schumpeter about the ideas of creative destruction, where Joseph Schumpeter had this notion that the only person who gets change in an economy is an entrant. Incumbents in an economy are colluding and blocking all entry. And in his view, the only way society could progress is to get rid of the old structures. A more modern view was developed by Philippe Aghion and Peter Howitt and others in their formal modeling of this work, where the entrant is making change and is pushing for progress, but incumbents can be maybe not colluding, they could be blocking, but they don't necessarily have to be the ones who are ganging up. But the most modern view is the one Ufuk came up with, where he in his empirical work on enterprise and his theoretical work shows that both incumbents and entrants can add value. So now suddenly we're in a world where it's not a new firm, not an old firm, not a young firm, not an old firm that adds value. All of them can add value, all of them can block change. So how do we figure it out? Let me show you 3 examples. This is an example with a photograph of Nandan. And the reason is that we often are trained to believe that incumbent firms in an industry are the bad guys, they're the villains, and they keep small firms out of the market. And that's a lot of the discussion we have seen in the last 2 days. But in India, when Tata's tapped into the talent of its elite technical institutions to create TCS, they became the first exporter of computing services to the US. Now, TCS could have really used their market power and stifled everyone's creation. But what it did in practice, it opened up the world's eyes to India's high-quality talent for software development. And many entrants took advantage of this opportunity. Among them, Infosys, a company that was founded by a lot of former engineers from IBM and financed by their own savings, dramatically increased the value it created, and now has become the global leader in technology consulting. But Infosys and all other companies in the sector kept investing in R&D and kept playing in global markets. The incumbents and the entrants were all there to see global market access. And what this example is showing, that both incumbents and entrants can add value and they can diffuse global technologies. The second example, which is about the Schumpeterian model in the worlds of Aayog and Howitt, is really applicable to social change. And it really shows us the value of lowering barriers to talent accumulation and allocation. And this is an example from the US documented in the literature. In the 1950s, the majority or almost 90% of doctors in America, when America was a middle-income country, were white men. Today, it's largely women and people of different ethnicities. And the reductions in labor market discrimination against women and minorities during the 70s has now helped the US economy become almost 40% larger than it would have been if those levels of discrimination had prevailed. And of course, there's room for progress, especially in innovation, but it clearly shows that bringing in the talent of people whose skills are not valued and allocating them to tasks has huge economic potential. And third is the original Schumpeterian lens, which I think is most applicable today to tell us about the debates on the energy transition, where incumbents in the high carbon industries, they've been around for 300 years. Cities have been built around them, our preferences have been built around them, and the product processes have been built around them. And what we find in countries like Turkey and Pakistan, about 85% of fossil fuel of energy produced is through SOEs doing fossil fuels. And 85% of renewable energy is from private sector small producers. So there's clearly this whole story about these entrants in low carbon technologies pushing for change, while the incumbents are colluding to block change. But what the Schumpeterian framework really tells us is that to be useful for policy making, we need to be thinking more carefully about efficiency. And that means for firms, we know that both entrants and incumbents can add value. But our metrics that just focus on the size distribution of firms, they miss the point. We need to figure out which firms add value, which stiffen the status quo. For talent, a good measure of creation is efficiency in talent acquisition and allocation of talent to task. And socioeconomic mobility is much better as an indicator of seeing this kind of progress than looking at other metrics of inequality. And finally, in the discussions of energy, they focus way too much on the sources of energy. But even in the most advanced European nations, renewables are no more than 7 to 10% of total energy produced. But given the huge inertia that we see and the interdependencies, we need to think more about emissions and more carefully about emissions intensity. As I only have 2 minutes, I'm going to show you 2 charts, and then I'll hopefully keep the rest for Q&A. What we do in our research is that we find that there are 3 big problems in middle-income countries. The first one is that we don't see efficient firms expanding. And this is a chart on the left that shows the life cycle of firms in the US, India, Mexico, and Peru. In the US, a firm that's born small, at 40 years old, it's about 8 times the size. In India, a firm that's around in the market for even 40 years is probably no more than 1.5 times the size it was born. So what's going on? A large part of the problem that Ufuk and his co-authors show in their research is in the US, there's this up or out dynamic. If you're not doing well, you exit the market your resources are reallocated to firms that are doing well. In India, what we see, exit rates, well, there isn't much of an exit rate. So firms are there, maybe they're entrepreneurs by need and not by ideas, and they just don't have, or maybe, as I've been told by some people, that maybe bankruptcy laws are so flawed that that the entrepreneur can't just get rid of the capital and then kind of go and do new things. But this is a huge issue. The second point, I think linking to the discussion we had yesterday, is that as middle-income countries grow, the demand for skilled workers increases. India is sort of at the bottom out there. And at the same time, what we see is that in most of the middle-income countries, women's participation in the labor force is pretty low. And what our research has shown, while the need for talent and skilled workers increases, most middle-income countries are not only scarce in talent, they do a really lousy job in allocating talent to tasks. And my final point, and I will close, is that we also find that middle-income countries lack both in energy efficiency as well as something that you won't hear in many other places, they're lagging in reliable and affordable energy. So if they were to kind of expand emissions cuts, well, they need to think about affordability and reliability of energy as well. I'm out of time, but I'm going to leave you with the framework that we developed in the report, that what we see right now in the forces in middle-income countries, that creation is really weak, the forces of preservation are incredibly large, and policies aren't really using crises to destroy outdated arrangements. And I'll be happy to provide you some ideas in the discussion on specific examples that we develop in the report. Thank you.
Thank you, Somik. I think that was illuminating. One message which I am carrying back myself, which will be relevant to a lot of people, that strategies that worked when you were a low-income country may not be relevant and will not work when you're a middle-income country. And there's another way of saying it, the problems of the last century have largely been tackled in a country like India. Maybe another 2 years, they're not going to be issues anymore. The problems of the next century require a different set of skills and a different set of approaches. And in an address to all of us in March, the Prime Minister actually said that, what worked for the last 75 years may not be enough to take us through. So at least people are conscious of this problem at the top. The question is, do we have answers? Do we have solutions? Now, I move on to Ufuk. I'll ask him to make the next presentation. He's already been quoted in the previous one, and let's hear him out.
Thank you very much, Poonam and her team. Thank you very much for putting such a wonderful program together and making me part of it. So this morning's session and Somik's presentation set the stage extremely nicely. Today I'm going to talk about the middle income trap, but I would like to emphasize two important points. As Somik emphasized, countries from being poor to being a frontier country, they have to go through 3 phases. And the first phase potentially is much better understood. Indeed, since Solo's insight on how capital accumulation works, as long as countries can accumulate capital and their economic decentralization or centralization, it doesn't necessarily point us in a particular direction, can potentially make the countries pass that phase quite rapidly, but I think it's much more challenging to pass the middle phase and graduate to upper middle income and then high income stage. So I would like to emphasize 2 points there. When the country passes the first phase, now economic centralization cannot work anymore and economic decentralization is needed. And in particular, business dynamism and factor reallocation and competition among firms becomes a critical force. And that's why in the WDR, creative destruction and Schumpeterian forces are particularly important. So that's why the title says that Schumpeter must meet Solo when we come to middle income phase. And the second point I would like to make, which made me think, yes, after yesterday's session, there has been some mentioning of industrial policy. And, from a couple of our work, industrial policy, it's a dangerous tool. If it's not measured properly, indeed, it might even slow down or worsen the resource reallocation, which is, something that the policymakers also don't want to do. So since we talk about centralization and decentralization, now I would like to go to two extremes. One, the US economy, and the other one is the Soviet Russia. And when we look at the evolution of the Soviet Russia since 1960, there was a quite rapid increase in GDP per capita until mid-70s. And starting mid-70s, Soviet Russia completely stopped. And now, according to, of course, there can be many, many different arguments to be made about this, but one, according to the framework that we are referring to, Soviet Russia managed to go through the capital accumulation phase fairly rapidly, indeed, to put the capital together. Probably, whether you're in a decentralized or centralized economy doesn't make a huge difference. But once you enter the middle phase, now economic decentralization is needed, and Soviet Russia was lacking exactly that. So now when we do growth decomposition of the two economies, Soviet Russia and US, and now I'm adding also two additional economies, East Germany and West Germany, what we are seeing is that planned economies are primarily growing through capital investment and capital accumulation. Whereas when we look at the market economies during that time, more than 50% of the growth came from productivity growth. So these are completely different sources of growth. And now I would like to go a little bit deeper about the evolution of the productivity. So how do these different group of economies differ? Market economies, US and West Germany versus planned economies, Soviet Russia and East Germany. So what we see here is that we are looking at the firm size distribution, and on the left, in the market economies, we see a lot of smaller firms, whereas in planned economies, we see primarily large firms. So if it was really about large firms, then planned economies have already their large scale, then they should be thriving. Clearly, we don't see that in the data. So large firms didn't deliver in Soviet Russia or East Germany. Now I would like to go a little bit deeper and look at the business dynamism measures. And this is exactly where the Schumpeterian dynamics start to come in. So business dynamism could be through entry. Maybe entrants might have a good idea and they may come in and replace incumbent, the usual Schumpeterian early Aghion-Havit or Schumpeterian insight. Or, as Somik also mentioned, dynamism can also come from incumbents. It doesn't have to be only from entrants. Maybe as long as we can keep the competition high among incumbents, still those companies can deliver. When we look at entry and exit, the yellow one is East Germany and the red one is Soviet Russia versus the blue bars are West Germany and US economies. So entry and exit didn't exist in planned economies, obviously, and entry and exit was very, very high in planned economy in market economies during that time. So now, as I said, it can be by entrants, but it can be also by incumbents. So as long as the productive incumbents are growing and absorbing the resources in the economy, that can also lead to productivity growth. When we look at the job reallocation rate, which is job creation and job destruction rate, whereas, through which we must be reallocating resources towards more productive firms, it was much higher in market economies and it didn't exist in planned economies again. So there was no business dynamism in that sense. And for instance, we talked a lot about, is it large firms, is it small firms? Typically, the argument in those questions were, will large firms lead the productivity? Whereas what we are arguing in the report is that productivity should lead the size. Productive firms should expand and absorb resources. When you do simple Olley-Pecos decomposition, for instance, what you see here is that in market economies at the time, productivity and firm size were much more correlated, whereas there was no correlation between productivity and firm size in planned economies. So now, one important assumption underlying argument there is responsiveness. If my firm receives a positive productivity shock or technology or innovation, do I grow? Do I hire more people? Do I absorb more of the employment in the market? That's what the literature called responsiveness to productivity shocks. When we estimate the responsiveness to productivity shocks, it didn't exist in planned economies, as you would expect. Whereas in market economies, the responsiveness was 200 times more, meaning that if, by the way, when you look at the productivity shocks, the shock process, of course, shows some difference, but there isn't a massive difference in terms of, Soviet Russia and US productivity shocks. Because there are a lot of arguments saying that, well, Soviet Russia also came up with a lot of technologies at the time. Yes, but those technologies couldn't hit the market. So, and technically, this is what we are measuring here, basically. If there were new technology shocks, if there were new productivity shocks, did firms grow as a response to this? In market economies, yes, 200 times more, whereas in planned economies, there was no response. So as a result, when we do, simple counterfactual exercises, just if in 15 years, through these business dynamism effects, we can explain 18 to 35% income difference between planned economies and market economies just through resource reallocation to innovative and more productive firms, basically. So that's why business dynamism is really critical in market economies. Now, this doesn't mean that having a market economy will be sufficient to have business dynamism, as Somik also mentioned, because there are also a lot of other ingredients that has to be taking place in the country. So Somik already showed that churn and turnover is not as strong in India as the US market. And now I'm going to show you further studies. So there was a very interesting paper by Nick Bloom and co-authors that showed that one of the best predictor of firm size in India is the size of the family. Now I'm going to build more on this, and then I'm going to argue that when a business owner wants to expand their business, of course, first, when I open up new shops, I need to hire new managers to run those businesses. My aunts were going through the same thing, actually. They were producing fish nets, and my aunt has 3 sons, and they literally opened 3 different locations, with 3 different shops, and not the 4th one, even though it was a profitable business. And most of the time, you're worried about other problems in the country. And here, in our paper, we, for instance, looked at the probability of delegating tasks to non-family managers in India. And of course, larger firms were more likely, but larger families were much less likely to delegate the managerial tasks. And if in the region there's higher trust reported by the World Value Survey on the system or on the neighbors, on the police force, then again delegation is higher. Now what's interesting is that firm size and family size in the second line correlates strongly. Firm size and family size correlates strongly, but less so in high trust regions in India. Meaning that if people have the trust on the system or on their neighbors, it seems like this correlation breaks down, which through the lens of our theory, it can be explained because these people can delegate the managerial tasks to non-family managers. So I would like to spend just 2 minutes on industrial policy very quickly. Again, industrial policy has been utilized many, many times in the history. One prime example is the East and West Germany after the reunification in early 90s. So this shows the East Germany, the red one, and the blue one shows the West Germany. And now let's just look at today's GDP per capita and innovation per capita at the regional level. First, East Germany was extremely heavily utilizing industrial policy at the time in order to make sure that East Germany converges to West Germany. And here, this is showing the subsidy per capita, and East Germany was an outlier in early 90s in terms of the industrial policy. Let's look at the outcome today. These are the heat maps of different parts of Germany. You can still see the border. Even though there's not a physical border, there's an economic border between East and West Germany. And today, the income per capita gap is still more than 20% after 30 years. And look at the innovation gap. There are many, many other measures. But despite those heavy policies, the 2 regions didn't converge. So what happened? Industrial policy has many, many different forms. We have to differentiate between high-quality growth versus induced or enforced growth. And unfortunately, the latter was what was implemented in East Germany at the time. Of course, we can make firms grow if you impose tax for not growing, or if you impose punishment for not growing, firms will start grow, also in India. And that's exactly what the East German government did at the time. There were labor commitments during privatization. Most of the companies were subject to labor commitments, which means that they had to grow their size, otherwise they had to pay fine to the government. What happened? Those firms that were subject to binding labor commitment in early 90s grew by 30% in employment relative to the rest, which looks like, they created jobs. But this was an induced job creation. When you look at, for instance, what happened after the contract was ending, and it's the red line, all the labor numbers were just simply coming down because this was not a quality growth. This was not an organic growth, and this was a forced induced growth at the time, and it disappears immediately when the labor contracts are over. So that's why when we focus on industrial policy, we should not push for induced growth. We should encourage for quality growth. And unfortunately, in the US, we also see some puzzling facts, and that's how I would like to conclude my presentation. When we look at the US economy, since 1980, GDP per capita has increased from 2% to 3.5%. Sorry, not GDP per capita, R&D over GDP. R&D intensity increased from 2% to 3.5%. US economy spends on R&D almost twice as much. Any growth theory, any of your favorite growth theory will tell you that this economy should grow faster. Unfortunately, the productivity, if anything, has slowed down in recent years. So then what's happening? Of course, just looking at the aggregate numbers could be misleading. We have to also look at the composition of those R&D spending. Which type of companies are utilizing the resources? And when we look at the data, this is coming from confidential Census Bureau data, and what we are seeing here is that large firms are disproportionately more utilizing R&D tax credit in the US. And in those states and industries where there's an active R&D tax credit policy, market concentration is 17% higher. So these policies are correlated with also higher market concentration in general. Now at the micro level, I would like to show you a very interesting event study. I'm going to look at a single inventor who changes a job. An inventor moves to a large incumbent versus moving to a small firm. And I'm going to look at the two different indicators. First, what happens to the earnings of this person? When an inventor moves to a large incumbent, the earnings go up by 12%. The wages or salaries go up by 12%. Maybe you might say because they are more productive in large incumbents, they are not more productive. Indeed, they are less innovative in large incumbents. When you look at these light blue bars, it shows that their productivity, their innovativeness declines by 6%. They earn more in large firms, but they are less innovative in large firms. And now, how are the two related? Can we build a relationship between R&D tax credit and this red flag hiring? Indeed, those firms that are actively claiming R&D tax credit from the US government are 39% more likely to engage in strategic hiring. So I showed you two large economies, Germany and the US, where industrial policy is, of course, heavily used in different periods, and they were not necessarily leading to the expected outcome. Don't get me wrong, I'm not saying that industrial policy is necessarily bad, but without having a clear guidance and without really measuring what's the outcome, then all these well-intended policies can even make things worse. Rather than just leaving things stable, they might even make things worse. So that's why I think these things have to be really carefully utilized. I think I'm out of time, so let me stop here. Thanks.
Thank you, Ufuk, but I'm sure there'll be questions later on. So we have heard an excellent indictment of industrial policy and why it doesn't work, but I'll reserve some thoughts of mine to a later point because this is something which seems to be back in fashion globally, and we need to see how effective that is going to be. But industrial policy, if at all it has to be there, it also requires state capacity. So I invite Karthik Muralidharan, who's been doing also work on state capacity in his recent book, The State-Led Roadmap to Effective Governance, Accelerating India's Development. Whoever has bought the book, it's quite a few days read and can put you to sleep after 30, 40 pages. So but it's an excellent piece of work, and I think I've at least said all my staff and all government bureaucrats should be reading it. Karthik, up to you.
Thank you so much. I think, and thanks for the opportunity to connect micro and macro. So I think at a very high level, I'm just going to do two things, right? So this is a complete report. So I'm just quickly going to provide some conceptual comments on the WDR with linkages to the discussion so far in the conference, but really focus most of my time on the implications for India because this is a global document, okay? So, basically, if I was to summarize in one bullet, like the core of the point is that growth comes from factor accumulation and comes from factor productivity. In the early stages, it's mainly about accumulation, which is investment, which is easier. Later stages are primarily about boosting TFP, and that's much harder, okay? And making this transition is not easy, and kind of what gets you to one doesn't get you to the next, hence the risk of the middle income trap. So I think substantively, this is a great piece of work. Ufuk, I have a bunch of more detailed technical questions, but that was great. So just a few high-level thoughts. I think one is I have a quibble with, I think, the calculation where you show that 71% that the physical and human capital ratio is 71% and the output is 21%, and that's because I suspect you're only measuring years of schooling. I don't know if you're measuring quality of education, right? So I think there's now, just given that most of my work has been like on the micro side of education quality, the paper I like the most is Todd Schulman Restart 2011 that shows that in this cross-country growth accounting framework, once you account for the quality of education, the share of education doubles in explaining cross-country variation. So a year of schooling in Vietnam is very different from a year of schooling somewhere else, and we've seen some of that discussion. So I think, it's just something to reflect, and then in a classic, any kind of Lucas model with interactions, then the H can just blow up in terms of how much it explains, right? So I think the H is an important piece. I think the other 2 points are just, they're related, and it's more, I think, because I only saw the slides and not the report, so it may still be in the report. But I think this is just like, I think, a pedagogical point that is worth highlighting enough, that the difference between process and product innovation, I think, is really worth spelling out, because I think when you talk infusion, you sort of have a bit of this in mind, saying that let me infuse more advanced technologies and improve certain parts of my processes, that innovation is kind of new products. But I think just making that distinction more clear will be useful, I think, for non-technical readers. And connecting this to yesterday, I think I spent a lot of time after Deepak's comment yesterday thinking about this technology productivity paradox, and with Shumitro, and I think a big problem is just measurement, right? So we're measuring technology mainly by kind of looking at budgets of hardware, but not looking at the processes within the org, and this takes a lot of work in measurement. So Diego Komen has, I think, this really impressive set of research initiatives of just kind of really measuring processes within organizations and kind of a technology maturity ladder. So it's not about the hardware, it's how you change your processes, okay? So similarly, I find this broad agenda of saying this doesn't change TFP not that satisfying, because TFP is a measure of our ignorance, right? So if you want to get into that black box, you have to invest in measurement, and that's true, and that's why I like the Bloom Van Reenen agenda so much, because it's getting into that black box of productivity, and I think what Diego does here is similar. So again, you don't have to change anything, it's just something worth citing and referring to. I think, and this is a point which you obviously know, and it's in Ufuk's comments, it's in my comments, but I think, again, to the extent that the WDR is not just a research document, but a teaching document, like of translating research to the world, I think not enough people seem to fully internalize the difference between TFPQ and TFPR, right? So you can improve productivity, so this is the productivity in the output, the quantity of a sector, versus kind of the TFP in terms of the revenue, okay? So you can grow productivity in sectors with low income elasticity, right? And the classic example, say in India, is you can grow rice productivity in Punjab, okay, by putting a bunch of subsidies, but the income elasticity for that rice is so low that is not going to give you growth, even though the productivity has gone up, okay? So, and that's why I think linking the dynamism to that point, right, which is reallocating, so there's a dimension of reallocation which is within a sector from less to more productive firms, but there's another dimension which is across sectors from kind of low value to high value sectors, and that's, I think, so I don't disagree with anything you're saying, so this is just simply a pedagogical point about making this clear in the context of policy discourses that often happen. And I think this is, again, really important to acknowledge, right, that I've now seen a lot of micro evidence that there is this real trade-off between productivity and jobs. And in a place like India, this can be very salient in people's decisions to adopt kind of labor-saving technology. So as a good faculty member, let me advertise an outstanding project by a PhD student of mine who will be on the market in the fall. And he's done this great project, right, where he's looking at the adoption of drum seeders in agriculture in Telangana, okay, and it sharply reduces kind of the number of daily wage laborers you need for transplanting rice, okay. So it's this really nice example of agricultural productivity increasing technology, but he finds there's a reduction in wages. There's a reduction in wages, which is what you would expect, and there is some social pressure, right, like you mean to not adopt things because then you're not providing the job. So it's just something that is worth thinking about in a context of, of a labor surplus economy like India. I think the last point, which will then transition to the state capacity issues I'm going to talk about, is I think it's worth at least mentioning the direct role of TFP in the government sector itself, okay? So a lot of how, when we think about policy and how policy affects kind of productivity, dynamism, etc., we're correctly thinking about how laws affect the functioning of the private sector. But the government spends 25% of GDP, okay? So now, the traditional view on this is just that, state-owned enterprises are bad. But in fact, the inefficiency in government departments is way worse, okay, than in state-owned enterprises, because the SOE at least has a balance sheet, and you can compare kind of a public and private company in the same sector. If you go look at the efficiency of government departments, it is horrendous, okay. So the reason for writing the whole book is to kind of highlight how much low-hanging fruit there is in improving that, okay? So the other reason I want to highlight this is because sometimes, and this is a challenge for research and policy, right? So because policymakers are under kind of pressure to act, right, we often don't even know enough, but people are still going to act, right? So, and like Ufuk, importantly, and I want to repeat that message again and again, right? So coming in with the feeling you need to intervene can more often than not make things worse, okay? So the other reason to focus on TFP in the government is this is directly in your control, okay? So this is within the government. You don't have to then think about what am I doing outside. And so then that transitions to, how I'm going to take this idea and then, just bring it back to India. And I think the big picture story, and this goes back to, I think, what Barry was asking, right? It looks like growth is great, right? Like, so why are we having all of these micro problems? So at some level, India is doing well, okay? So growth is decent, whatever you might kind of quibble about the numbers. There's macro stability, there's size, the demographics are good, democracy we've seen, and the diaspora is a huge asset, okay? So there is a lot going for India. But the problem, or kind of the glass half full version, is that the simple story of the Indian economy, okay, is that the top 10% is what drives growth, okay? So this is broadly the segment that has either high entrepreneurial income or predictable salary income and creates demand. You've got another 30 to 40% in service sector jobs supporting the top 10%. So any of you, if you have domestic help who you're paying 20,000 rupees a month, that person is in the top 20% of the income distribution, okay? And you've got a bottom 50% that's primarily left out, and the politics of the country is that that's a demographic that is carried along with welfare programs, okay? So we saw yesterday Secretary Garg kind of, proudly list out all of the social welfare schemes, and that is over 25%, of the budget, okay? So, and this is working, okay? So this is not to say this is, there's a lot to be happy about this. 10% of India is still 140 million people. That's like in the top 10 countries in the world. So that is large enough to kind of drive this engine that's the Indian economy. But we can't function at full potential if you're not firing on all engines, okay? And so firing on all those engines is then going to require and this is constrained by profound challenges in the delivery of basic public services, okay? So whether it's education, we've seen 50% of kids graduate primary school without being able to read. You've got, horrendous challenges in higher education, health, malnutrition, child development, public safety, and what that means for female labor force participation, justice with a backlog of 30 million cases, and welfare. I think something that's unappreciated is kind of the general equilibrium linkages between the structure of the welfare system and the nature of job creation. If I have time, I'll talk about that, okay? And all of these contribute to productivity and job creation. Now, so these are going to be components that allow people to participate broadly, but it's then also going to require the enabling conditions for firm dynamism, which I do talk about, but I talk about in chapter 16 after I talk about these things, okay? And so the one last point I want to make before I get into some specifics is I do worry about kind of, sometimes it's easy to get into this false sense of grandeur and call ourselves a middle-income country, and we're not, frankly, okay? Because there is so much variation across the country, right? So GDP per capita in Tamil Nadu, Bihar, in Karnataka is 5 times higher than Bihar, okay? So what you need for Bihar and UP is not what you would kind of call as part of a middle income trap. They are still, like, I mean, at a much more basic level. So we are going to need differentiated thinking, and I think the locus of just policy thinking on almost every key issue that faces India needs to shift to the state level, and that's why I'm delighted that we'll have this paper in Punjab in the next, in the next panel, and happy as the IPF to commission that paper, okay? So how much time do I have? 0? Is it, no, or did you not start it at all? 2 minutes, okay, good. All right, so, so I think what I'm going to do, just one slide here, since, the idea here is to get into research. So coming back to the centrality of state capacity and governance. So here's Rakesh Mohan, one of the kind of key architects of the 91 reforms, when he does his review 25 years later, says that the way forward for accelerated growth is being held back by governance deficits in all areas connected with the delivery of public goods and services, okay? And as usual, Lant always says things more colorfully, right? And this is Lant in 2008, right? That the weak performance of the Indian state is one of the 10 greatest challenges facing humanity, okay? And this is because if you think climate change is important, if you think these things are important, every global problem is mediated through the state, and the state is basically so ineffective that the return on investment and focusing on that is really, really high, okay? So my biggest point of departure in this book is to say most of our discourse focuses on what government should do, and we spend remarkably little attention on how will the government do it, okay? And so before we start loading more and more things, you should do this, do that, like, you got to figure out what are the basics and can you do them well, okay? So I'm just going to end with, saying, the economic case for investing in state effectiveness. And the reason for writing this book is that the one kind of common pattern across 20 years of my work, those of you who've known me, my early work was in education, but over the years I've done work in welfare, in health, in child development, and one common pattern in kind of carefully peer-reviewed studies done with 5-10 years of work is that the social return on investment and investing in governance and state capacity are often 10 times more than simply spending more in a government as usual way, okay? So in education, most of our money goes to unconditional salary increases, zero impact, okay? So that's a QJE paper called Double for Nothing. In contrast, even a modest 3% performance pay, that's my job market paper from like JPE 2011, had these huge effects. NREGS, implementing in kind of smart cards, biometrics, reducing corruption was 10 times more cost effective than so the leakage reduction was over 10 times the cost of the program. And then we have this recent Econometrica paper last year just showing how the general equilibrium labor market effects of improving implementation was as big as rolling out the program itself, okay? So that implementation is so first order that we just don't pay enough attention. More recently, child development, this is a paper that just came out in the JPE, where we see that just putting an extra worker in Anganwadis, right? Because you've got this one woman who's taking care of child development, household visitation, nutrition, maternal counseling, and maintaining 14 registers. And we find that this significantly improved early childhood learning and reduced child malnutrition and stunting. And we estimate this was 12 to 20 times ROI on cost. But again, where does our money go? It goes to unconditional salary increase. Last point on the judiciary. Postdoc of my Manaswini Rao had this lovely paper showing how kind of hiring every extra district court judge essentially clears another 200 cases a year, and because 70% of these cases are land and credit, which are factors of production that are locked up from being used, that you get a significant increase in economic activity, okay? So the bottom line is that most of our focus coming to the big picture of development for 50 years has been on this Bhagwati Sen growth versus development debate, okay? So should we be focusing on getting the growth? Should we be doing social sector? And my point of departure, and I'll come back and tie it with Ufuk, is that focus on the top line of budget allocation distracts us from the much lower hanging fruit, which is the quality of expenditure is so poor regardless of what you spend on, that if you focus on the pipes and the effectiveness of public systems, you can do more of everything, okay? So another way of saying this in the cross-country macro literature is that the estimates show about 20% of variation is K, 20% is H, and about 60% is TFP, okay? So you can think about the agenda I'm pushing here as the agenda of boosting TFP within the government, which is one of the largest players in the system. So, thank you.
Thank you, Karthik. I'm extremely happy, actually, that there's nobody from the finance department in this room. There is a budget in preparation right now, and this is an indictment of how government expenditures are actually either misspent or underutilized in terms of effectiveness. And there's a lesson for all. We have one more speaker. We have heavily off time, so I'll not have any more comments after this session. I'll just have Q&A. I'll call Ashish Dhawan for the next.
Thank you. I'm not an economist, so I'll share more general thoughts. I'll echo what Karthik was saying, which is that if we look, some of us may question the GDP data, etc., but I think India has done incredibly well over the last 30 years to reach a point of getting to $2,800 per capita. And I don't think the journey going forward to $12,000 per capita, where we're still at middle income, we're not looking at escaping middle income, which is really the journey over the next 20, 25 years, needs to be that different. Other than the fact that we need to prioritize some areas, but India has been a stable place, the macro has been fairly stable. We've done a number of things right in moving towards more of a market economy. And we need to, firstly, I think just remember that we need to continue on that journey. A point on the growth versus development, I think too much of the focus on India is on development. And if you even look at this conference, I don't see too much conversation around growth and what will accelerate India's growth and what are some of the binding constraints. And Land has a wonderful paper that shows that growth is not only necessary, but it's sufficient as well. And that HDI is over 90% correlation with GDP per capita. So I'll make 5 or 6 quick points. Firstly, I think that what we could do differently over the next 20, 25 years. I think a lot of our growth has been lopsided. It's been focused on a few states really accelerating. They've grown much faster over the last 20, 25 years. They are the usual suspects, the ones in southern and western India. And therefore, the northern states, the eastern states have been left behind. And largely because many of these states there isn't a pro-growth focus. When was the last time that Bihar even tried to attract private investment or tried to create the enabling conditions to attract private investment? We all talk about Odisha doing well, which it has done well with some social programs. But where has Odisha done anything to diversify away from the metals and minerals sector? It's been an absolute failure. It's a coastal state. It should have been exporting to a great extent. In my mind, it's been a disaster as far as economic growth is concerned. Or if we look at, Punjab, where there'll be a discussion on Punjab, which was one of our richest states. Now there's some conversation about industry and development or economic growth, but where's the conversation on economic growth in Punjab over the last 20 years? So I think that we really need a much broader base of states that have been economically dark over the last 20, 30 years, to start to mimic some of the policies, the approach, create the enabling conditions that the southern and western states have over the last 20, 30 years. And I think that's very possible. We're seeing some signs of it in some of the economically dark states. Second point is around exports. There was a lot of conversation yesterday evening about uncertain and unpredictable world, globalization, etc. But we know that goods exports is 25 trillion. Even if it were to drop to 20 trillion, which I don't think is likely, I think most likely it'll plateau at 25 trillion, may grow slowly. India's share of goods exports is only at sub 2%. So from an India perspective, and we know there's the China plus one, we know that Southeast Asia's value chain is polluted with China, and in the lighthouser world, Vietnam would get branded as being China. So India has a golden opportunity, and I think we need a very strong mission on exports. Indian exports need to go from 2% to 5%, in the next decade, and then go to 10% by 2040 in India's share of global exports, with a particular focus on labor-intensive exports, where in each sector, I know NITI Aayog has been working closely with NITI on electronics, and I think garments is not a lost cause, but every one of the labor-intensive sectors, we haven't lost the game. There's a real opportunity for India to gain significant share. Our global share in labor-intensive exports is at 3%, China's at 30%. So there's no reason why we can't crawl up at a much faster pace than we have done historically. A third one is around ease of doing business. Everybody's talked about it. I know we often celebrate the one or two small victories. A few laws got decriminalized, etc. But when I look at the pain points for the SMEs, and Subbu was talking about this earlier, I think we need a much stronger focus on working with state governments, on rationalizing labor laws, Factory and Building Act, land. We know what the pain points are. We need to listen to these SMEs much more closely, do more enterprise surveys, and really work on, truly improving ease of doing business. Particularly, a lot of this is in the control of state governments. A fourth is urban. Sam brought this up, and Subbu also talked about this. I think NITI has got a wonderful focus now on, looking at urban areas as engines of economic growth. 60+% of our GDP is in urban areas. Most people don't even know what the GDP of most of our urban areas is. We don't understand the labor force composition in these urban areas. We haven't really looked at what the major public investments are that are required in these areas and what will crowd in private investment. But I do think that alongside creating these plans, these economic plans, we will need much larger investment in urban regions going forward. We have done a lot in terms of increased infrastructure investment in rail and road, but I think the investment in urban areas is still very limited, and that needs to increase dramatically. A fifth point is around moving up the value chain. Even though a lot of what we need to do is basic stuff as we grow from 2,500 to 5,000 per capita. But I do think as we look at going forward, this idea of eventually looking at innovation, moving up the value chain is important. I sort of disagree that we should completely disregard industrial policy. I think there are many sectors in India that got hollowed out, and using some degree of incentive to get those sectors back. For instance, the electronics value chain back to India. There, at least, the incentives seem to be working. And there are other areas where they may not work, but they can be retweaked. And the amount of money we're putting to work is really quite small as a percentage of our GDP. I think on R&D, all of corporate R&D today is only $10 billion. All of corporate R&D today is only $10 billion. I think by 2035 it needs to get to probably $100 billion, which will still be 1% of GDP. The real question is, what incentives could we provide to help accelerate that, even further? I know there was some discussion by Ufuk on some of the problems with R&D tax credits, etc. But and we've had our own share of problems in terms of incentives for R&D. And a sixth one really is around the sort of continuing to provide a fairly stable macro environment. And I'll put out there, really, I don't see enough thinking in India around how we bring the long bond rate down dramatically. I mean, if you look at all of ASEAN, in Thailand, Vietnam, all these countries, the long bond, the 10-year bond is at 3-4%. And obviously it would mean much more fiscal discipline to make that happen. But charting out a plan to really get structurally the interest rates down, because we need to grow our infrastructure over the next 25 years. And I think staying away from, because in the Western world, I mean, my own view is America will go through some degree of Japanification in the coming decades. Europe has already seen it. And it will lead to a bunch of ideas springing out, which we ought not to replicate. We ought to stay the course in terms of, focusing on belief in markets and the trajectory that we followed over the last 30 years. So in summary, I think we've done a reasonably good job. I mean, even though some people question GDP, I know the corporate India sliver is a small sliver. I mean, there's a lot going on beyond that. But if you look at the data coming out of corporate India over the last 10 years, it's not that different than the data coming out 10 years prior. And that's not necessarily an indicator that GDP growth is the same over that period of time. But I think sometimes we can get too skeptical also about how India is performing. I think India is doing well, we're on a good trajectory, and there's a greater prioritization of pro-growth policies will lead to continued 6-7% GDP growth over the next 25 years. Thank you.
Thank you, Ashish. That's nice to end on a bullish note. So we've got about 10-15 minutes. I will only go straight to the audience for questions, no more from the panelists, and let's economize in time. Yep.
Thank you. I have a question for Karthik. You told us a lot about TFP in government and how we could improve it. What specific measures would you do to improve them, right? Because would you cut down the size of government, make government departments more efficient by putting performance measures? I don't know. What do you suggest? For Ufuk, you talked about industrial policy as being an evil tool, right? Now the question I ask is, the Korean experience, which we've also discussed a lot here, is sometimes taken as a special case, right? Because they introduce competition alongside industrial policy. What view do you have of this dual approach? Thank you.
So I wanted to inject a little bit of finance into this discussion, because as you scale up, I was surprised not to hear much about two markets that I think are extremely inefficient in India: market for corporate control and market for credit. And as we scale up, we need assets to be redeployed. But there are so many frictions on the bankruptcy side, on the contracting side, that's not happening. And we have a massive allocative inefficiency going on there. Now, talking about credit, Ashish did talk a little bit about that toward the end, about the cost of credit at the sovereign level. But if you simply look at the friction we have from deposit to credit, the rents that the intermediation sector keeps with itself in providing credit, it's very inefficient. And as we have to grow, we have to scale up, free up. So the way I see this as a financial economist, that in India, for the very, very top firms, the markets work at some level because they're the reliances of the world. At the very bottom, you have a lot of subsidy and government programs, it works. And then you have the missing middle where these markets just don't function to the point that we want them.
Thanks. Mike Fishkatak, LSE. I had a conceptual question about the middle income trap. It's analogous to the poverty trap, and we know that there are self-reinforcing forces, so you could be in a bad equilibrium or a good equilibrium. But most of the points that I learned from this session seem to point more to a conditional convergence view, where after a country grows for a bit, it is bumping into certain constraints, which are in the, say, what in the growth framework is the A parameter. And then unless you do various infrastructural investments, institutional reforms, that's not going to change. So I really wanted to, because traps create some optimistic policy views too, and maybe that's where a big push industrial policy could come up. So just what your thoughts are would be useful to know. Thanks.
Three quick observations. First, I actually find the concept of middle income rather problematic, because I wonder how, let's take the United States, when its per capita income was the level of current what we call middle income countries. It was, after all, the frontier country at the time. So don't we have to be, in a sense, time specific as we think about the middle income trap, or anything about the middle income, these middle income countries? Maybe you do it, you clarify this concept in your report. I look forward to reading it. A second observation I would make is that I don't think a solo type model with just one sector really captures the dynamics, especially in the initial phases of economic development, because the levels of productivity in agriculture are extremely low, and moving out of agriculture generates a huge growth rate if you can do it successfully. And in my view, that's why we saw Japan, dramatically move from 10 to 4. We saw China similarly slow down dramatically. So I really missed it in the story. Now, you delivered a lot of stuff very crisply, so I think it's unfair in terms of what I'm saying, but it is a fact. The third observation goes back to this idea of industrial policy. I happen to have worked on I don't consider myself a proponent of industrial policy which is sectoral in nature. I think, though, it is the essence of industrial policy to focus on sectors. And that's why I don't think it's fair to judge industrial policies by an R&D tax credit, which, after all, applied across the board to all in sectors. So there are general policies, and then there are sector-specific policies, and you gave us a horse race, in a sense, and you drew conclusions about industrial policy, but the instrument you used was a general subsidy to all, to any firm in any sector that was able to do R&D.
I have a couple of question for two of the speakers. So, Ashish, you may not be an economist, but I agree wholeheartedly with what you said. Let me say, I think we should focus more on growth than development. I come from Bihar, I can tell you, and we've done enough of giving a lot of benefits. Let's focus on that. On your question of industrial policy, I'm very confused what it means, and I know that East Asian experience, they did have industrial policy, so maybe there's some merit, but the big thing in India is that the trade is hugely protected, and that is not going to work. I mean, let's be very clear about that. The third thing, you talked about the 10-year bond. I mean, it's not a mystery. I think our fiscal deficits are very high. I also think the inflation rate compared to other countries is high. So that explains it. On urbanization, I'm not an expert, but in my mind, urbanization is an organic, endogenous process that happens when, industries develop, services develop. So I don't quite understand the idea of planning urbanization in terms of, as a policy something. Sure, the smart cities, I understand the concept. And the second thing is, I'm going to be very quick, and this is related to Ufuk's presentation. I found it very fascinating, but I want to understand where you see China. And I'm going to invoke what Tosh just talked about, finance. I think it's a very ignored area when people are working on these topics, because my own experience on China, which I worked very intensely actually on, I think China's story is really about inefficiency in the financial sector. It has a huge financial sector. If you look at a very crude measure of capital output ratio, incremental capital, it has been rising like crazy. They have huge investment rates, one of my main jobs actually was to assess the financial system, which it took me 2 years with 30 people. I was leading this project. And I'll tell you, data is all messed up. I hesitate to say they are cooked up, but I think they are. Non-performing loans are extremely high, and they've been there for a very long period of time. So the only way they are keeping growth going is really through pumping money. That's it. So let me stop there, but I would love to hear your views on where do you see China in your story?
Yeah. I'll have two quick questions. We are running out of time. Jan and the gentleman at the back. Yep.
Yeah. Interest of time, question to you, Karthik. I haven't reached the stage of
on the, the urban governance, urban planning, and decentralization of governance. But what are the 3 or 4 major quick fixes that you see, given the current political economic scenario in the country, the political dividends that, people think arise out of centralization, and but the need at the same time for creating capacity in our urban governance, because the entire governance thing, the growth center, etc., are predicated upon the, developing capacity in urban governance. Where are the 3 or 4 easy, low-hanging fruits, easy quick fixes?
Thank you. Yep.
Just a question on skills. It came up in a couple of contexts. Somik, you started by showing that the skills scarcity is a big problem, and in some sense it's completely obvious. But I think we need to unpack that. Karthik made this point about the quality of education. No arguments. But what do we do about the skills issue? And here, I think my concern is really we're seeing a lot of skilling programs. Governments all over are spending a lot, and yet when we're doing these RCTs, and in fact, Gaurav has a very recent study, we're finding very limited returns. And so, it takes me to something Nick Bloom had mentioned in a couple of contexts, which is that, it's the firms which deliver skills, and his good example was McDonald's. It takes a very average set of workers, and it just uses fantastic training material. You don't even have to read. In fact, when I went to Sri City, I went to a Hasbro plant which had been relocated, and I saw sign language, not sign language, sorry, just signs. So you have this problem where you've got governments pumping a lot of money, the skills not being delivered. Are we investing in the wrong type of skills? Is it managers? Ufuk mentioned Nick Bloom's work on managers. Is that the kind of skills that we need? So
thank you.
Yeah.
Last question, Praveen. We close there. We need time for answers.
Thank you. Fascinating presentations. My questions, I suppose, are for my one question is for Somik and Ufuk, and it's a variant, I think, of Ratna's question, which is I'm not a China expert, but when one looks at China, it appears as if it's done very well following this path of the 3 I's that Somik laid out, the kind of the investment, the infusion, and innovation. Would that be a correct reading of the Chinese sort of story? And if so, could you talk a bit about how they've succeeded in sort of doing this? Is it state intervention? Is it organic private sector development? Thank you.
It's a huge bunch of questions. So I'll start with Ashish, who probably has the least.
Yeah, I don't have much. I think there was something on credit. I agree with you. I think that credit works better for larger companies, but I think that's changing with the asymmetry of information problem getting solved, more data being available. If you look at SME credit, credit to mid-market, it's grown quite a bit, and the cost has come down as well. I think the bankruptcy code, clearly applies more to the larger companies, but it has sent a signal. If you look at just behavior, and this is anecdotal, my sense is earlier there was no fear because you could never lose your company or your company would never be shut down. And I think there is a change in behavior now, is my sense. We'll see it when the next credit cycle hits as to whether that's for real or not. And then on trade, yeah, I do agree that trade is protected, but I do think in a number of areas now, India is looking at not just import substitution, say with electronics, but export. And as you start to think about that, you start to rationalize duty structures and things like that as well.
Ufuk? Okay, so excellent comments. First, I would like to clarify one thing. And I tried to make it explicit in my talk, but I didn't have much time to elaborate on this. I'm not against industrial policy. Indeed, in my class, in the second midterm, every year, if there's one question that I'm asking the optimal policy, find the optimal subsidy rate. And there are many, many reasons, theoretical reasons why we should do industrial policy or subsidize or give tax credit. But I'm not willing to approach blindly. I'm a measurement person too at the same time. And I would like to do data-driven policy intervention because we are spending, first, a lot of taxpayers' money is being spent. And second, every time you distort the prices, it means that somebody else or some other firms in the economy are also being influenced by that. So when you subsidize some firms, and if you just focus on those firms, yes, they are going to invest more. If you make bread cheaper for me, trust me, I'm going to buy more bread. But other people won't be able to buy as much. And other people will be financing me. So as long as we have the numbers right on the table, then I don't have a problem. But, blindly, I have many, many examples. It's, yes, I talked about the R&D tax credit as an example, but there are so many other examples. Let me give you one example from my home country, Turkey. Turkey is among the OECD countries. In terms of subsidy to R&D relative to GDP, it's one of the highest. And also in terms of spending on tertiary education, it's one of the highest among OECD countries. But when you look at the output in terms of patent per capita, in terms of academic publication per capita, it's one of the last countries. Because it's not about the resources that are being spent, but it's about the composition that we have to also pay attention to. When it comes to composition, you're absolutely right that normally we have to really pay attention to firm size distribution very, very carefully. It's not, whenever we observe a lot of small firms, like in India, or many developing countries, also in Turkey, middle-income countries, a lot of those small firms are there. It's not necessarily an opportunity for us to give them credit so that they can grow, but it's a sign that somehow competition doesn't work. And if there was competition, those firms would have been eliminated. Indeed, it's a sign. It's not an opportunity. It's a sign that somewhere else in the firm size distribution, something doesn't work. Which brings me exactly to your point, where when you do impact analysis, for instance, there was a credit guarantee, massive credit guarantee in Turkey. Though the firms that gave the highest return, highest response to credit guarantee in Turkey were exactly the mid-sized firms. Not the small, not the large, mid-sized firms, because they are the ones who are really thirsty, because they proved themselves by delivering something. They came to mid-size, but that's exactly where they are now lacking the money and go to the next step. Rather than providing this uniform subsidies, or rather than providing all the money to small or large firms, let's do more data-driven, sector-specific analysis. And in my graph, R&D tax credit wasn't uniform. Indeed, not every state has the tax credit, and not every sector has the tax credit. There's a state sector variation, and when you look at those variations, you see that it definitely gives rise to further concentration. And so one additional thing that I would like to highlight is China. China is definitely the poster child of a growth story in the way we described it, in the following sense. When you look at the Chinese patents that are being produced in China, that are registered somewhere else, most of those, looking at the Chinese patent office data can be misleading. You have to look at other patent offices. When you look at the composition, until 2013, the majority of those patents were being produced by foreign companies that are residing in China. After 2013, that share started to decline rapidly, which means that there was a lot of technology transfer by those firms. Not only that, there is also an enormous reverse migration to China. Every year, more than 1 million students who are educated globally are returning back to China. Can you imagine how much knowledge they are carrying with them? And the third example I would like to give is our study with Josh Lerner from Harvard. We looked at the Chinese investment in the US, in Silicon Valley. Indeed, when you look at the China's investment in the US, they are investing through corporate venture capital firms. China was investing in those fields where they are backward, where they cannot produce locally, especially in more basic fields. They were subsidizing or investing in new startups in Silicon Valley. After 4 or 5 years, patents start to emerge also in China, which shows that indeed there was a very systematic approach to growth. The one final thing I would like to mention also is that when it comes to industrial policy, it's really, really a huge issue that we have to consider. For instance, there was Austin Goolsbee paper in 1994 where he was showing that when you subsidize firms, rather than innovation and patent increasing, what increases is the salary of the scientist. Why? Because the supply of scientists is fixed, engineers is fixed. When you create more appetite by the firms, the people who will deliver those technologies fixed. As a result, you're just paying more money to those limited engineers. What is the policy approach here? What's the more healthy policy approach? First, strengthen the talent pool. First, strengthen, without having good players, your team cannot win the championship. Even though, India managed to win it because it had the good players after so many years, it managed to strengthen the talent pool. Just like that, first, focus on education policy, especially let's discuss the role of universities. Let's discuss the role of PhD programs, not just average years of schooling. Because to push the frontier, you need a handful of really talented, well-educated people to do transformative things. That's how our lives got transformed globally, right? Through these, Einsteins, Marie Curies, etc. So that's why I think we have to be a bit more focused rather than thinking, universally, I think.
Yeah, thank you. I think we're running out of time.
Mr. Subrahmanyam, I was hoping that Somik and Karthik will let go of their time and will just give the
Yeah. Okay, I'll give 1 minute to Karthik if you want to answer the most important thing you want to answer, and 1 minute to Somik.
No, I think, yeah, so the $1 million question, I was going to answer that last, but since I have only 1 minute, I think it is the hardest problem, right? I mean, and so, like Montague said in his endorsement of the book, he said the 91 reforms in some ways were easy because that was getting the government out of the way, okay? Whereas the next generation of reforms are making the government more effective at what it has to do is a much, much harder problem, right? So the logic of kind of why the book takes the form it does is because it's a menu of ideas and it also focuses on actions at the state government level. So the reason for that is to partly increase the number of change makers, right? I mean, who can then try different things, because I don't have there is no guarantee that here is the script that's going to work, right? So I think Rohini Nilekani said this very nicely, right? Which is, you often, as experts, you start by thinking you're dispensing solutions. But I think what I'm really hoping to do in the book is to distribute agency rather than distribute solutions, right? You need to then empower kind of the frontline change agents, saying here is a menu of ideas that I can work with, right? So, yeah, and I think I can answer specific questions
we'll carry on,
Karthik, but I'll stop there.
Thanks a lot. Yeah, Somik.
All right, just 3 points. Okay, one. So, two, okay. Maitresh, I think you made a very important point. What we do is looking at club convergence and conditional convergence, and we say there is a possibility of you getting trapped if you don't do the right reforms at the right time. And so in the report, I'll send you a copy as soon as it's out. We look at all these growth slowdown episodes, but then when reforms happen, you have the potential to take off. The second, Rana, your point, the skills we look at are engineering skills, professional skills, and managerial skills. And those are the ones, it's not just skills, but those specific skills. The third, I think this whole debate on industrial policy needs to be revisited. There's a Mariana Mazzucato part of the world, which is saying let's do all kinds of, government knows the best, and let's pick what to do. That's absolutely unproven. Then there's a kind of opening up, there's a trade-related issues, that the discussions yesterday on the tariffs, import requirements, import bans, etc. And the third, Ufuk, the one you speak about, is when do you support domestic industry if you can show there is a knowledge spillover or a positive externality that we're dealing with. I think on most cases we have evidence on none. And Ratna, just on your last, on the China thing, Ufuk is very bullish. I'm pessimistic, because China did very well in infusing global technology, but now what you see, first, you don't see anything because you don't have data after 2013, and second, all you see is corporate suppression, where you're telling private firms to invest in certain companies, in certain sectors, so they'll do well. If you invest somewhere else, it just won't work. And when you look at the patent data, China appears to be an outlier, but a lot of these are foreign companies who are just using Chinese kind of nodes to register patents. So I think there's a lot to be said about questioning whether China is going to be, rapidly growing. But we'll all discuss it at lunch. Right?
So I thank all the panelists. Thank you very much.